the achievement gap and what we can do about it. So, different kinds of achievement gaps. Looking hopefully briefly at the economic gap, the solid line here shows the African American white gap. It has closed on this graph. It's getting better, but is not the same outcome. The dotted line is the economic gap, which has steadily grown worse, and there's a huge gap in outcomes for lower socioeconomic groups. So a recent study showed that in public schools, high poverty schools, and schools that are composed of mostly minorities have doubled over the last decade. These schools generally have significantly less resources and lower graduation rates. Recently, the incoming kindergarten class has shown some improvement for the lower economic group, which seems to point to pre-kindergarten programs possibly are working. The gap between Hispanics and whites has narrowed, and it also estimates at the current rate of change it will take between 60 and 110 years to close the gap. So things have gotten a little better, possibly for low income, and things have gotten a little better for Hispanic students. So the implication is the numbers don't look better for African American students. The gender gap. The thing that we notice after high school is that there are fewer women employed in STEM fields. We have 8% of mechanical engineers are women. It's nowhere near 50%. 10 or 11% of engineers in electrical or computer hardware are women. So where does this come from? What does this have to do with teaching? I think that college studies have shown that women are called on less frequently and not given as much time to answer questions. The interesting thing I thought about the study was everyone in the classroom was aware that this was happening, except for the professor who was doing it. So it's a cultural problem, and if we have a bias in our mind, we don't realize we're doing it necessarily. So is the answer to teach girls separately? There's a lot of work done on single gender classrooms. What they find, although there's anecdotal evidence of girls doing better in all girls schools, the advantages are not borne out when studied scientifically. What research does show is that just like in the college study, boys are called on more often. They're treated differently when they are called on. So there's not really research that shows benefits of single-sex classes. What has found to be true is that for teachers who treat them fairly, female high school students perform as well as the male students. So it's not about anything other than boys and girls both do better with a good education. And it doesn't matter if the school is single sex or co-ed. So I thought this comic was really great illustration, and it's even titled How It Works. And this is how it works. We treat people differently based on their gender or their race. So what are we teaching the girls when we don't call on them in math class? What are we teaching the boys and the girls when we give the girls less time to answer a question? We're teaching them this very thing, the very reason why there's a lack of women in STEM fields. We're teaching them socially that girls don't belong in math or engineering. So one way to get around this, if we cannot see our own social biases playing out as teachers, you can randomly call on students when doing cold calling, and that way everyone in the classroom is potentially going to be called on. We can give all students the same amount of time to respond to a question. You can put your hand behind your back and use your fingers or count mentally. Count to 3 or count to 5 and give students a good pause before you say anything. And be aware of gender and cultures in word problems. Certainly in math, we come up with problems all the time, and you could ask yourself, why is a Tom or a Joe driving the car? Why can't Sally be driving the car? These kinds of small things, when they're pervasive, do teach our students socially about what is appropriate and what is not. And we're responsible for creating that. Now, in terms of race, a really interesting piece of research I ran into showed that African American women with higher self-esteem about their ability to do math more frequently enroll in a four-year college, which is really amazing. And there's research that shows everyone who enters a four-year college out of high school has a much better chance of graduating with a four-year degree than any other group. So for the African American women in your classroom, we can actually make a difference to them as a group statistically if we can improve their self-efficacy. They will have a better outcome. Some of them will. Things we can do about closing the race gap: see if your school has an interest in doing something about it. One thing that can be helpful is to group minority students together into one section. See if are there other teachers who are willing to help create a program to change outcomes. Successful programs actively recruit minorities and young women. You have to talk to teachers, go through test scores, you target students and talk them into the benefits of taking the higher level math classes. You have to talk to their parents and get the parents convinced that they want their children doing this. Another thing that's worked really well in some schools is check out the communities that the students come from. They have resources and they want their children to be successful also. Successful programs have the time and resources to mentor them. because it doesn't happen by itself. It takes extra hours. So you can learn from school that do promote excellence in math. They usually have meaningful relationships between students and teachers, high expectations, and rigorous curriculums. Successful programs also reduce minority students' isolation. That is to say, when there's one or two African American kids in a math class, there's a lot of self-perceived pressure on them. The thinking is it's hard to respond to a question because they feel like they're representing their entire race. And if they give a wrong answer or appear stupid, it's going to condemn everyone who's African American. And so there's a tendency to shut down and not participate. And that doesn't help anyone to get better grades. So how would you feel if you were the only person of your race in a room? Would you be afraid to answer questions? If we can get administration to group them into one section so they can be together, they'll feel less alone and do better. So when working after hours during free periods before or after school, when trying to create this math community, it's important to include food and drink and social interaction so that it becomes a social setting, not just another math class. To try to teach that this is what we do as students of math. We eat together, we talk to each other, we help each other study, we help each other do homework, and by working together, we can teach students how to create study groups. And then they can be successful not only in high school, but also in college. So things to remember, young African American women have better outcomes with positive math self-efficacy. Don't discriminate when calling on students. Popsicle sticks aren't good just for avoiding gender discrimination. It works for racial discrimination as well. Give all students equal time to answer questions. Be aware of gender and cultures when you're setting up word problems or giving out assignments. So we did lots of research, and it was difficult to cut it down to the presentation.